Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you. I often lament to have these kinds of discussions virtually. I prefer to do them in person, but the one benefit of this virtual environment is that I am able to reach people as far as my colleague Christine in Nigeria. So pleased to see her and to see all of you, familiar names and hopefully faces and new ones as well. My name is Tracy Weldon. I'm professor of English and linguistics here at the University of South Carolina. Also currently serving as the interim dean of the graduate school and vice provost for graduate education. I am one of several associate producers of Talking Black in America, which was produced by the Language and Life Project at North Carolina State University in 2017 and funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation. Just by way of some background, the Language and Life Project was established in 1993 by sociolinguist Dr. Walt Wolfram with the goal of cultivating research, education, and outreach programs related to language and culture in the American South. Since its inception, the LLP, or Language and Life Project, has conducted over 1,500 sociolinguistic interviews, produced over a dozen documentaries, and distributed a host of other outreach materials, including CD collections, trade books, museum exhibits, and dialect awareness curricula designed to educate the general public about the rich linguistic fabric of the United States. Talking Black in America, which is the first in a four-part series currently under production, represents the latest installment in their documentary series. Filmed in a variety of rural and urban locations throughout the United States and the African diaspora, this film showcases the historic and symbolic role of Black language varieties and highlights their tremendous impact on the speech and culture of the United States and around the world. Through the perspectives of everyday speakers and the guidance of historians, linguists, and educators, it also addresses the persistent misinformation that circulates about Black speech and sheds a light on patterns of linguistic discrimination that continue to affect speakers of Black varieties in this country. Talking Black in America was produced and directed by Neil Hutchison and Danica Cullinan, and the executive producer is Dr. Walt Wolfram. So before we begin, I wanted to go over a few ground rules. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to view the film and perhaps even the second installment in the series, which is focused on Black American Sign Language and called Signing Black in America. Both have been streamed free on YouTube all month, and if you haven't had an opportunity, hopefully the discussion today will inspire you to take advantage of that free access before the month ends. What I'd like to do today is guide you through an interactive discussion of the film. We'll use this as an opportunity for some self-reflection and some sharing, and of course some consideration of the implications of this important topic for classroom instruction and educational settings more generally. I'd like to emphasize that this is a safe space for you to share your views and opinions openly without judgment or censure, though I do ask that you be respectful of others' views as well, perhaps especially if they differ from or contradict your own. Before we begin our discussion, I thought it might be helpful, since we're perhaps coming from a variety of different backgrounds and disciplines, to just make sure that the terminology that we're using is familiar. I will be using a few terms that are used in very particular ways within the linguistic discipline. The labels African American English and more recently African American language are most commonly used by linguists today to refer to the variety that is the focus of the film Black in America. Older terms that you've also perhaps seen in linguistic literature include Black English, and there's also the term spoken soul, which I admit is one of my favorites. It's the term of a textbook that I use when I teach African American English to undergraduate students by John and Russell Rickford. And of course, there's the term Ebonics, which gained popularity in the late 1900s following the controversy surrounding the Oakland School Board's proposal to recognize the variety in classrooms and to use it as a bridge to teaching standard academic English. For a variety of reasons, that's not a term that linguists tend to use, and I'm happy to talk about why if you're interested in that when we get to the Q&A. But the reference is the same. You will also see in the questions that I've proposed to sort of prompt us today the terms dialect and perhaps also accent. Sometimes in non-linguistic circles, these terms are used interchangeably, but in linguistics, they have very specific and distinct meanings. The term dialect is used to refer to any variety of a language that is spoken or signed by a group of people, whether regionally or socially constructed. Any variety of a language spoken or signed by a group of people, whether regionally or socially constructed. So when we talk about dialects, we're talking about what linguists will call the full range of a language, from sound, word, and sentence structure to social and pragmatic rules of usage as they are shared and understood by members of a speech community. So in that regard, everyone speaks at least one dialect of whatever language they speak. To speak a language is to speak some dialect of that language, and many of us speak multiple dialects. The other term, accent, refers just to the pronunciation features associated with one's speech. Sometimes, especially in the United States, as we talk about regional varieties of American English, the aspects that are most salient are those aspects of pronunciation or accent. And so sometimes the terms dialect and accent get used interchangeably. But from a linguistic perspective, accent only refers to pronunciation features. And everyone speaks with an accent, right? So in non-linguistic circles, sometimes we use the term accent to refer to what we might call foreign accents or regionally defined or specific accents or accents that are somehow marked or different from our own. But in order to pronounce the language, we have to have an accent. And so everyone speaks with an accent and everyone speaks a dialect. And then finally, from a linguistic perspective, it's important to recognize that there's no such thing as good or bad English, or any language for that matter, or correct or incorrect features of a language. In order for a language to serve as a tool of communication for a speech community, the language must be used in a way that is systematic and rule governed. So these judgments of good and bad and correct and incorrect are really social judgments about the speakers themselves, but there's no linguistic basis for that. And I think that's a point that was also made in the film itself. So we'll try to the extent that we can to avoid using those terms in our discussion today. Perhaps, that will be difficult in some instances, but to the extent that you can, try to avoid those terms so that we can look at the language objectively and recognize it for its systematicity and rule governedness. Okay, so I think that will put us all on the same page. What I'd like to do to get us started is to move us into breakout groups. You should have received by email a set of questions that I wanted you to reflect on, just to sort of get us thinking and talking to one another. The first set of questions gives you an opportunity to sort of think about your own language and do some self-reflection and some sharing within your breakout groups. And then I want you to pivot and talk a little bit about what it means to talk, what that term means, how it gets taken up, and so talk about that as a small group, and then we'll come back and do some sharing within the larger group, and then I'll talk to you about where we'll go from there. Some good discussions were happening in those breakout groups, and I apologize. I'm sure we didn't give you nearly enough time to have a thorough discussion within the smaller groups. I know, yeah, that's the downside of it. But I'm hoping we can continue this discussion as a larger group. There are 59 of us, so we won't all be able to share. But if anyone is willing to talk a little bit about the first set of questions here on the slide, how would you describe the way you speak? Do you have a name or a label for it? Has anyone ever commented on the way that you speak, and how did it make you feel? And I'll say that there will be several questions like this that I'll use to sort of prompt discussion today. These questions were actually adapted from a broader, more extensive set of questions that are available on the Talk to Black in America webpage. And so I'll point you to where you can find those, and you can certainly use them for your own purposes if you decide to use this as a tool in your own classrooms. So let's see. I want to make sure I'm looking at the hand in the right order. Emily, I see your hand up. Would you like to share?
Yeah, our breakout group was interesting. We had 2 Californians and 2 Southerners, and kind of found overall, I think that in California, folks who grew up there felt as though they didn't have any kind of accent or label for the way they spoke. For me, as a Southerner, I definitely was aware of my accent when I traveled anywhere and moved away, and I think I found that I sort of socially adopted the language that I was around because of the association with the Southern dialect with intellectual deficiency, if you talk really country. It's still in me and it comes out when I'm tired, but I also feel I've always felt like African American English has felt more comfortable to me as a Southerner than Midwestern or Northeastern kind of white culture language. So I'm interested a lot in this topic because of that. I feel like that same of like being told you sound black, being told you sound country kind of can have a similar negative connotation historically.
Yeah, really good point. Thank you for sharing. And there are lots of similarities actually between what linguists refer to as African American English, although there are certainly regional variations, and white Southern speech. And a lot of that has to do with the migration patterns that we'll talk about a little bit later. But it is also, I think, interesting that some of the negative stereotypes are shared by both varieties. Anyone else want to share?
I was sharing with the group that I'm a bit confused about my, whatever my accent is supposed to be, just because other people have had trouble nailing it down. Because I don't really speak with a Southern accent, although I'm originally from South Carolina. But I think because of my experience growing up with my father being in the Air Force and traveling around, I think that had a lot to do with the fact that my accent is a bit hard to nail down, because I think I've sort of incorporated different accents from the various places in which we've lived. And I think that definitely in the Midwest, because we spent 5 years in Ohio, and I think that definitely influenced my accent quite a bit. And
Yeah.
I don't know, perhaps living in Spain did too. But regardless, other people have always had trouble trying to nail down my accent, and that has always made me kind of wonder, okay, I have no idea what kind of accent I had. And as I told, or I had, and as I told the group, in college, I had an English professor who was going around trying to, having us speak, and because she was into linguistics, and she was telling everyone what type of accent they had, and then she got to me and she had no idea what kind of accent I had. And she said, okay, you just have a cosmopolitan accent. I have no idea what your accent is. You're just cosmopolitan. And so that didn't exactly clear up the confusion for me. But that did make me, that as well as my other experiences have made me feel a bit confused and a bit sometimes uncomfortable, because other people have kind of singled me out in different, schools that I've attended and so on, as speaking differently from everybody else. And that is not, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, moving around will have that effect because you're now getting influence from various regions of the country or different parts of the world, and so it can have that kind of leveling out effect. There is also linguistic evidence to suggest that there are particular aspects of the Southern accent that African Americans collectively have resisted, and so there are patterns of pronunciation differences that linguists call the Southern shift that seem to be specifically associated with white speech and not black speech. Some of that must be about ethnic identity and association. So, you know, it can be complicated. I am born and raised in Columbia. I went away from South Carolina from Columbia for about 13 years, and I've been back for 21 years now. I assume my language has changed in the process. I moved away as far as Ohio, and it wasn't until I was there that I even recognized that I was a Southerner. I hadn't really identified as a Southerner before that. But I'm also often told that I don't have a Southern accent. I do think that as I code switch, I'm in more relaxed settings that I sound more Southern. But you know, it's complicated.
I just want to mention, in agreement with Renee, that I grew up in the Army. So my father I was born in Virginia, lived all over the place, and a lot of time in Germany. And then when I became an adult, I married a soldier, so I was back to traveling again. So I stopped traveling when I was 35. So all the time I get, where are you from? You don't sound like you're from here. So Renee, I get that question all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
I can relate to that.
I was born in Virginia and I was raised in the Army.
Yeah. And much of, you know, how we sound and how we speak is not up to us. It's all about, you know, where we're born and what we're exposed to. It's not until later in life that we're able to make sort of active, conscious decisions about our language and to use it as what some linguists call an active identity. But that tends to happen later in life. You know, when we're acquiring language, we're not really necessarily thinking about the ways in which we can speak to associate ourselves with particular regional or social groups. You know, so a lot of it is just simply out of our control. I see a few comments about Southern accents being called country, which I also often think is an interesting label to be used.
It is interesting.
Yeah, so Mariah says, when I was younger, people pointed out my country accent and lack of enunciation used to really bother me, but as I've gotten older, I've been able to stop internalizing those judgments. That's great. I was using my phone voice, she says, during our group discussion, but my country accent doesn't really go anywhere despite my best efforts. Right. Julie, responding to Christopher, says, I've adapted my Southern speech to accommodate an English learner, either as the instructor or the staff assisting them. I think it must have been a comment from Christopher that I missed earlier. Christopher said, I've been in the South for most of my life, but I work with internationals and have lived overseas, so I feel my speech patterns have changed a bit to accommodate the international surroundings. When I get tired, I'm definitely Southern. Yeah. Okay, this is great. And so feel free to continue to share in the chat. I do want to talk a little bit about the concept of Talking Black, which of course is the title of the film Talking Black in America, and want to hear a little bit about your discussion of how you define that term, whether or not you found it difficult to define, and if so, why, and then why some individuals might consider it to be an insult to be told that they do sound Black or that they don't sound Black. Anyone want to share there?
Yeah, I'm happy to contribute. So my question was, do you think the professional voice that we're all using right now is something like an average or a common denominator that we all kind of implicitly agree upon is the easiest to use or understand or communicate with?
That's a great question. So linguists use a term called Standard American English, and there's some variations on that. Sometimes it's mainstream standard or general American English. And there's this assumption when you use terms like that there is this sort of neutral American English that we all have access to and can use in professional settings. In reality, that really is sort of an umbrella term for a wide variety of accents and dialects as well. And so, what we're using here in the South will probably on average sound very different than what you might hear if the same discussion is taking place, for example, in New York City or Houston, Texas, or Los Angeles, California. So, in the United States, when we talk about a standard, we're actually focused more on the absence of grammatical features that are stigmatized than we're talking about anything else. And that's a uniquely American thing. If you compare American English, for example, to British English, where there's this notion of received pronunciation, or what people sometimes call the Queen's English. A lot of that has to do with pronunciation features, less of a focus on grammatical features. But within the standard, there's really quite a bit of variation. And this question of whether or not it's easy to just use the standard really kind of depends on where your starting point is, right? And so, some of us have greater access to standard American English than others. And so for those who have less access, using standard American English in a professional context becomes much more of an effort, which is something that I wanted us to think about as we're thinking about our classroom context. Great question. Denise.
Hi, yeah, thanks. In our group, we talked about this, and I saw at least one comment about it. So understanding in the movie where talking white or acting white is, that can be a put down like in your own community. But it seems to me, my perception is that talking white really just means talking educated. It's a mark that you've been educated. And am I right? Are there other things that go into talking white or acting white? And just the movie was the first time that I really thought about, if you get put down, even if it's just jokingly put down, but from your family, every time you just use your education and put it into practice, that just seems like that would be really sad, and that I can see how that would be just an extra barrier to pursuing an education or any of that.
Thanks, Denise. Yeah, so there was a really provocative exchange between a group of guys in the beginning of the film where someone said he was insulted because he was told he didn't talk black, and the other person responded, you don't talk black because you don't sound black. I think that's actually a really important distinction to be made. The way I just described standard English is really a focus on the absence of these stigmatized grammatical features, means that, there's no one particular ethnic group that has a corner on the market when it comes to defining the standard. The standard really is ultimately associated with, the groups that have sort of power and prestige. And so we look to the language of those speakers for defining the standard. But questions of sounding black and sounding white, in spite of the sort of blind spots that we've had as linguists, we're able to do standard English and still use language in ways that represent our ethnic identities. And so there's actually quite a bit of sort of meta-linguistic commentary within the African-American speech community when it comes to these notions of talking white, talking black, sounding proper is another term that you often hear. There are ways in which you can use standard American English, avoid stigmatized grammatical features, and still sound black, right? And so at that point, it really becomes more about the rhythm of the voice, the pronunciation of certain features, and in some cases, the use of what linguists sometimes call camouflage features. These are some features that sort of, seem like they are shared by a wider, mainstream group, but are in fact used in very specific ways within the African-American speech community. And often African-American speakers will use these camouflage features without even recognizing that they are specific to the African-American speech community. But it's those ways of using language that allow speakers in certain contexts to be able to use standard English, but also sound black. But these are all about ways of socialization. So, there are certainly African-American speakers who don't sound black, right? I mean, it has everything to do with your life experiences and your exposure, and to some extent the choices that you're able to make. But these are about socialization and not about biology.
I was going to say that I come up from a speech language pathology training background, and it's really interesting how we've really, in the speech language pathology field, we've really stigmatized African American English in a way that's been really unhelpful. And one of the things just that in thinking about, it's really important not to equate using African American language with educational status. Like that's just something that in our field we are revisiting a lot right now. It's really important.
Thank you, Lisa. And Donna asked about the term metalinguistic, and I apologize for not defining that term, but that's really just talk about talk, right? So this sort of awareness about and explicit reference to talk. And so you often find within the African American speech community these circulating terms about talk, you know, to say someone sounds country or sounds proper or sounds ghetto is sort of metalinguistic commentary, if that makes sense. Okay, so this is great, and again, we'll continue to sort of reflect on these questions as we go through, but I am looking at the clock and wanting to talk a little bit about some of the other themes covered in the film. You might have noted as they sort of progressed through the film that there were various themes that were covered, starting with questions of access versus exclusion, talking about the systems and rules that govern African American English, a little bit about its history and development, the effects of migration, this notion of skill, language skill, and what that covers, and then, you know, some focus on transformation and change, where the language is going, and then the legacy that it leaves behind. And so there are some questions for each of these themes that I wanted to use to sort of prompt discussion. We don't have to cover all of them or any of them, but I think it would be useful to at least go through the themes and get your thoughts and reflections on some of the topics that were covered. So I'll start with access and exclusion. And this is a point that I think was raised just a few minutes ago. Some speakers grow up learning and speaking a variety of English that is considered mainstream or standard, while others grow up learning a variety that is considered non-standard and carries many negative associations. And so this points to this question of privilege. If you happen to come into a classroom where the variety that you learned in the home happens to also be the language of the classroom, it gives you a certain advantage. So the question is, why is it important to acknowledge the linguistic privilege experienced by people who speak a standardized variety? What advantages do native speakers of standard varieties have in school, in the job force, in access to service or opportunities? Does anyone want to share? Renee?
Yes, I do admit that I'm aware and all through school was aware that I did have opportunities that many of my classmates did not have because of the way I speak. Because I was always the one, even from elementary school all through high school, and even in college, I was the one that people wanted to recite a poem or read scripture or act in a play. You know, I was always the one that they went to, which in some cases was fun, of course, but also sometimes got a bit tiresome.
Thank you, Renee. Mariah?
Thank you. I'm kind of in the same boat as Dr. Harrison. I was always the one, oh, you speak so well, quote unquote. But I said at one point in the chat that I said in the group that we can't really define talking Black because Black isn't a monolith. It's a diaspora. So what people usually mean is more along the lines of, you're not using standard English or a version not recognized, so you're wrong. But the privilege in speaking the standardized English, because like I said, I'm very much in the same boat as Dr. Harrison. I didn't have to learn a whole nother language when I got to school. Language we spoke at home, even with a German mother, whose English was like her third language, it was still the same standard English that I learned in the classroom. So that was the main thing in my mind, was that I did not have to learn a whole nother way of speaking in order to move ahead.
Thank you. That really good points there. And there was a point that you made earlier, and I might have lost it. So let me just focus on the question of privilege when it comes to entering the classroom. This was essentially what the Oakland School Board was trying to do in recognizing Ebonics in classroom settings. What they had recognized is that there were students in their classrooms who were bringing a dialect in the classroom from their homes that was not standard English, and it was putting them at a disadvantage. And so they wanted teachers to recognize the rules of those home dialects. so that they could use it as a bridge to teaching them standard academic English. Now, the media sort of took that and spun it in a different way, and it became really much more controversial than perhaps it should have been. But I think, you know, from a perspective of teaching, recognizing that not everyone is necessarily coming with the same access to standard English, you know, either in written or spoken form, you know, is an important observation to make. And I guess the other point that I wanted to make, going back to your earlier statement, was just, you know, I mentioned that linguists, I think, have also been guilty of framing African American English only as a non-standard variety. And so I've just published a book on middle-class African American English that pushes us to sort of look at African American English with a broader view, looking at the ways in which, you know, racial and ethnic identity can be done across the spectrum from both standard to non-standard varieties and everything in between, as with any other language. So that's there. We just don't have the research to support it. Carolina.
When I first came to South Carolina, I worked as a First Steps home visitor and First Steps it is the state's program for at-risk families to help them get ready for school. And we all know that language is learned back in those first years of life. So my comment is that the young children are learning African American language and becoming quite fluent in it, and at the same time, uneducated home visitors, as I was, you know, I wasn't even recognizing that at the time that was what the child was speaking, and so I thought that there was, you know, a problem, and it was my deficiency, and so the same issue can be present in some of our young students who are going to be elementary school, early childhood educators. And so I think that this is really crucial for them to understand that the young children do have a competency in language that we don't give them credit for. And so this is giving me a lot of things to think about.
Well, such a good point. And going back to Oakland, you know, the controversy was that the Oakland School Board, or the perception was that the Oakland School Board wanted to teach Ebonics. Well, they didn't need to teach Ebonics. The students knew Ebonics and spoke it fluently, right? It was really about teaching the teachers the rules behind what they were calling Ebonics so that they could use it as a bridge to teaching them standard academic English. And I think we've gotten better when it comes to testing students, but for many years, students were placed in these, you know, these sort of courses for language deficiencies, when in fact there was no deficiency. They were simply using a different rule system than the test recognized. I think we've done a better job of recognizing the difference between deficiency and difference at this point. But I suspect we still have a ways to go with that. I want to sort of flip it, and as we're talking about access and exclusion, what we've been focused on in terms of access to the standard has us sort of looking at what linguists call overt prestige. It's the sort of prestige that's associated with power and you know, groups with power in a society. And it often opens doors for certain types of jobs and you know, guarantees some certain level of success, or at least allows for success in schools and other types of opportunities. But there's also something called covert prestige that I think this next slide speaks to. The question here is, have you ever felt an immediate sense of camaraderie with a person just from hearing the way that they talk? Did it make you feel like that person might have a similar background or some shared aspects of identity? What are some of the reasons that people might change the way they talk with different groups? So this really gets into this other type of prestige, which is known as covert prestige, and is associated with group solidarity and belonging, right? And so this idea that the way I speak is an extension of who I am, and if I sound this way, it says something about my identity. So I wonder if anyone wants to share in terms of access and exclusion from a sort of covert prestige, right? What it feels like to either be welcomed into a particular social group that you value or excluded because of the way that you talk, even if the way that you talk doesn't necessarily have the overt prestige that we've been talking about up to this point. Renee.
Well, I think I can say that, well, two things. Immediately, I do feel a sense of camaraderie with Mariah because I can tell that she and I had similar backgrounds. And when she was talking about her experience at home and not having to learn a different language when she went to school, because of her exposure with standard English at home, I had that same exposure also because my mother was an English teacher. And so I did not have to learn a different type of English or whatever, a different language, different dialect when I went to school. And English always came to me very easily, which is why I majored in English and taught English. Now, I do realize that, yes, I was able to join certain groups that perhaps other students couldn't join simply because of that also, because of the way that I talk. And I was accepted by a certain group of students, for example, or certain teachers because of that. I do realize that. And so there are advantages to it. I certainly admit that. Before, when I said it got a little tiresome, was just because after a while, when people keep asking you to do this and this and this, you know, you, at least I, maybe some people don't have a problem saying no. I, at that time, did have a problem saying no. And even if I wanted to say no, I'd still say yes because I felt like I really should, you know. And so that can just get a bit tiresome in that respect. But yes, there's an advantage to that. And I think that people do change the way that they talk with different groups. I know that I have found myself sometimes talking differently depending on who I'm speaking with. Um, I don't really use Black English, but I think I get close to it depending on who I'm speaking with. And perhaps that's the experience of others as well. Most of the time, I speak simply the way that I'm speaking now.
Yeah, and so linguists call that shifting from one dialect to another code switching, and not everyone is able to code switch. I mean, again, that has to do with having the access to the varieties to be able to switch fluently and authentically, from one to the other. There was a question in the chat from Denise about the difficulties of learning standard English in schools, given how pervasive it seems to be. And it's an important point, I think, because it's easy enough, I think, to recognize the challenges of learning a second or third language, because the barriers between these varieties that we call languages are distinct enough that we know, if you're speaking Spanish and I'm speaking English and we're not bilingual, we're not going to understand one another. When it comes to the barriers between dialects, because there's a shared vocabulary and there's a shared grammatical system, there's so much that's so similar, it's often easy to think that we are using the language in the same way when in fact the differences are so nuanced that we miss them. And so I'm going to use that to transition to this question of systems. And as a nice example, there's this feature, and I'll just go ahead. I was going to ask you to share the rule with me, but the film does talk about this feature called habitual be, right? And so the question here is, if you heard someone say the sentence, "she'd be studying," what would you think about it? Does it follow a grammatical pattern? What is the meaning of this sentence, right? So if someone were to say that, she, be, and study, and the ing suffix, those are all things that speakers, certainly native speakers of English, would be familiar with. These are not new words. But the particular way in which it is constructed here is in a very specific way that communicates something about how often she studies, right? And so when be is used in this way in its uninflected form, right? So not am, is, are, was, or were, but be, it only means habitually, right? So if you were to say, where's Carol? And I say, oh, she be studying next door, meaning right now, that would be ungrammatical, right? If I say she be studying, she can't go out in the evenings because she be studying every night, right? And you can put the every night on there. In standard English, it's required to have some sort of adverbial to communicate that habituality. But African American English is very rich in what we call its aspectual system. It actually puts in the grammar aspectual information such as habituality, remote time and distance. These are things that probably reflect the history of African American English and the languages that were part of its origin and development that make it different and distinct from other varieties of American English. But as someone who doesn't speak African American English, to hear someone saying she be studying, many would assume, well, she's trying to say she is studying and she's saying it wrong, right? And so this is just an example of how, if you look at it from the reverse, someone who only speaks standard English and perhaps hears things like she be studying all the time has heard it, but doesn't necessarily know the rule behind it. And so you have to acknowledge that that also works in the reverse, right? And this idea of the standard being pervasive, you know, it's a little bit tricky as well because, you know, when you're in your home setting and you're not hearing the language that you are hearing in the classroom, you really are not getting the kind of exposure. You're not getting it often, you're not getting it early, and therefore you may not necessarily be fluent in it. Okay, so let me see. Why are certain varieties denounced while others are praised? Why do we associate language varieties with character traits like uneducated or smart? Why are these associations so strong and easy to produce? This really goes back to this idea, you know, we're comfortable saying things like good English and bad English, correct and incorrect, because we think that there is a right way of using language and everything else is a sort of failed attempt at getting at it. But what we're trying to do as linguists is to show, as I said at the beginning, that the only way that communication can happen is if speakers follow a system, follow rules. If things were random, we'd never be able to communicate with one another. So all language varieties are systematic and rule governed. And if you say she be studying right now and you think you're speaking African American English, you're speaking it incorrectly, right? And so we really have to sort of position ourselves when we talk about right, wrong, correct, and incorrect by, you know, the variety that's in place at the time, and recognize that even those varieties that don't show up in our textbooks and dictionaries are systematic and rule governed. I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about the history, unless there are some questions that I need to clarify. Xavier, anything?
Yes, yes. I'm going to put them in the chat box. One is about the word aspectual that you use. If you can clarify that, and I'll place the other questions in the chat box.
Yeah, thank you. So the tense and aspect system of a language has to do with tense represents a point in time, right? So we can talk about things that happened in the past, things that are happening in the present, things that will happen in the future, and that's tense. With any particular point in time, we can talk about the nature of that event, and that's called aspect. And African American English shares with some West African language varieties and some Creole varieties, which will sort of move us into this question of history and origin, a rich aspectual system, meaning that even within a particular time frame, we are able to, as African American English speakers, communicate information about the nature of an event, whether it is you know, habitual or not. We talk about things happening in the remote past as opposed to the more recent past, and put that information actually in the grammar itself, right? Whether that's through some pre-verbal marking or some suffix that's added to a verb in ways that standard English can't and doesn't do. And so in order to communicate the equivalent information, you have to have, you know, an adverb that says, you know, for a really long time, a long time ago, every Friday. And so that's what we mean by aspect. It's rich and aspectual information in ways that mainstream standard English is not. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So, how do you see chat dialogue as different, better, or worse than verbalized speech? So, we understand that writing is secondary to speaking, right? And so, we don't learn to write as a first language. We learn to speak, and then the writing or the written form comes later if we learn a written form. So it's always a sort of reflection or a secondary representation of patterns of spoken or in some cases signed language. But I do think it's fascinating to sort of see the ways in which identities, age, peer group interactions are sort of reflected through those kinds of things, and also the ways in which alternative spellings are often used to reflect pronunciation differences. That's something that you'll also see if you look at sort of social media, Facebook or Twitter and the like, where you have varieties that are not written. They don't have a written standard, but they are communicated through these sort of chat features. They're really kind of creating a written system through through these social media interactions. And so it's an interesting phenomenon to sort of see, because it gives you a nice snapshot of where the language is in a particular point in time. And I don't know if I actually answered your question, except to say that, yes, it is interesting. It does sort of reflect, but it also, sort of pushes us beyond, previous ways that we're able to communicate it. It's part of that transformation. Language continues to change and meet the communicative needs of its speakers. So this is just another way of sort of looking at language transformation. So let me talk a little bit about history. Walter Edwards in the film said what they did was to invent new languages, new varieties, taking linguistic properties from the surrounding varieties and creating new forms. These are creations of people put in an absolutely horrible set of circumstances, and out of that milieu came new language forms. So this is one of the theories about where African American English comes from. It traces back to the transatlantic slave trade and the contact between speakers of West African languages and speakers of English that resulted out of the Atlantic slave trade. It has been said, though there's some controversy around this, that there was a concerted effort to separate Africans who spoke the same language from one another so that they could not communicate and form uprisings. And so out of that sort of language context situation, these varieties emerged that were called first pidgins and then Creole language varieties. And those are terms that are used to refer to languages that emerge in situations of contact where speakers don't have a common language. And so they create a new language in order to communicate with one another. So one of the theories is that African American English began as this sort of plantation Creole. And then following the breakdown of the plantation system, as speakers of the Creole interacted more with speakers of other American English varieties, the language underwent a process known as decreolization, becoming less Creole-like, reflecting its sort of contact history and more like English. But there are certain distinctive features, like that habitual B, for example, that are unique to African American English that seem to reflect that earlier past. And what happens in those contact situations is that the language of the speakers with the most power and prestige is the language that the vocabulary is borrowed from. It's called the lexifier language. So that would have been English in this particular instance. The West African languages, though, would have contributed a lot in terms of the grammar and the pronunciation. In the same way that when we learn a second or a third language, we tend to learn the words, but we often sort of impose our own, sentence structures and certainly our own accents onto that target language until we become more fluent. And so you see these contact varieties that have sort of vestiges of that West African influence that make African American English, if this was in fact where it began, distinctive from other English varieties. And so this is just an important point, I think, to make, that there is a history, right? This is not about failed attempts at speaking standard English. There's a history there that I think flies in the face of this idea that speakers are just being lazy, they're dropping G's. We try to avoid even using a term like that because it actually reflects it's a myth, right? If you say walking as opposed to walking, well, there's no G even on the walking, right? There's no G that's being dropped. What in fact you're doing is you're moving that sound at the end that we call a nasal. We're moving it from the back of the tongue, raising up, walking, to the front, tongue lifting up, walk in. So we haven't dropped anything. It's a different pronunciation, and it doesn't reflect laziness. It just reflects, a different way of pronouncing something that you've probably heard and used because others in your speech community use it. And so I do think it's important to recognize that there's a historical basis for African American English. I've sort of witnessed the ways in which Gullah Geechee, which is a Creole variety spoken along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, that community has really made a concerted effort to sort of trace its history, the connections to Sierra Leone and other areas in West Africa. And in doing so, I think, at least from an outsider perspective, has sort of elevated its perception as bad speech, right? Because now we recognize that there's a historical basis for the distinctive variety that we recognize as Gullah Geechee. I don't think we've gotten there with other African American language varieties, to the extent that, we recognize this as Ebonics. We don't recognize this as having some historical basis. So I'll leave that there and see if we can maybe get a couple more things in. There's a part in the film that talks about migration versus exodus, talking about the great migration from the South to the North and the ways in which patterns of racial segregation in the North and the South differed, and the effects that might have had on language. Does anyone want to share any thoughts about that part of the film? Anything eye-opening, any aha moments that came out of that? Carolina?
Well, I thought it was interesting how in the North, Black-only neighborhoods were more prevalent as opposed to in the South, that there was a little bit more mixing. And so the African American language in the North got more solidified, I think, because there was less of the interaction with the white folks in the North.
Yeah, really good point. And there was a time in the 80s, late 80s, that linguists were acknowledging what appeared to be sort of a Black-white divergence that they attributed to the sort of social isolation or even ghettoization of Black communities in northern cities. And so, as people continue to move and migrate in different ways, language is going to reflect those kinds of patterns in the same ways that, as we sort of recognize even today, the difference between a northern or northeastern accent, a southeastern accent, that reflects migration patterns of British English colonists who came to the United States and brought with them particular regional varieties and settled in particular parts of the United States. And the reason that the Midwest is often seen as more neutral, sometimes there's this idea that there is no Midwestern accent, is because it's there that you get the mixing and the mingling, right, between the more northern and the more southern extreme accents. So all of this is just sort of a reflection of the ways in which contact and isolation also contribute to this sort of dialect or accent fabric of American English. The question that's on the screen now speaks to this question of whether or not it would be beneficial for people, for society to have a global language common to us all. Whether or not that's realistic, I think, is one question, but would it be desirable? What are your thoughts on that? Would it be easier if we all just spoke the same way? Donna.
So the problem with that is then we've put a value judgment on what is the way, and I take issue with that.
Such a good point, right? And so that really ultimately goes to the ways in which language is a reflection of our identities, right? And so if we agree that we're all going to talk the same, well, what's the same? Maybe we should all speak African American English. Well, there are many who would love that, and others who would say, but that's not who I am, right? And so this is why I think, you know, I don't think it's a realistic goal, and I don't necessarily think it would be beneficial, because it would remove much of what makes us who we are, right? Language really is a reflection of our cultural, our racial, our regional identities, and other aspects of our identities as well. Renee, and then I'm going to go on to the next screen.
Okay, I'll make this very quick. I think it would just take away each person's identity if we all spoke exactly alike. And it would be, someone said boring in the comments. I agree. It would be very boring because, you know, who wants everyone to sound exactly the same? There's no interest there, no variety.
Yes, very, very good point. So I want to talk about skills. If you hear the term language skills, what comes to mind? From a classroom perspective, when you say that someone has strong language skills, I imagine that that refers to writing ability, perhaps, you know, someone who's good at poetry or various other types of written genres. What do we value when we talk about language as a skill? The film focuses on hip hop, and there's a question here about whether or not hip hop might be seen as an art form, and whether skills associated with hip hop might be translatable to the classroom. Does anyone have any thoughts, maybe from the film or from your own experiences as classroom instructors, to share here? Mariah.
I don't necessarily have like any in-depth commentary about it, but hip hop is 100% an art form. It's poetry, and if classrooms and educators can use hip hop in order to teach poetry, as opposed to, I don't know, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, the longest poem on earth, you know, I think that they should. If Nas or Jay-Z or whoever can teach my students what rhyme is, what rhythm is, what iambic pentameter is, then I absolutely think we should.
Thanks, Mariah. Yeah, there's a great quote in the film about hip hop artists, you know, using double and triple entendre and not necessarily even knowing that, right? There would be English professors, you know, if you know, circumstances might have been different. Danny.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to, in reference to your comment about the classroom, I had a class that did a songwriting project with some inmates at Lee Correctional Facility here in South Carolina. And one of the really beautiful moments of our collaboration were a student from Taiwan who rapped with the inmates, and also a white student from South Carolina who had never listened to hip hop before, who really gained an appreciation for that when he decided he wanted to perform in that way. And so just wanted to just share how that, you know, you might bring something like this into the classroom.
I love that. And I do think that acknowledging people's identities, cultural identities, and traditions as a way of engaging them in the classroom is bridge building in important ways that don't necessarily always happen. So we're almost at time, and I'm going to just go to the last question. This slide here speaks to Martin Luther King, recognized as one of the greatest orators of our time. It's interesting that those who are praised, African American speakers who are praised for their oratorical skills, are not often recognized as African American English speakers. And so if we are to start to look at African American English as this sort of broad spectrum and not just you know, non-standard features, I think it's important to bring speakers like MLK into the continuum as we do that. And what I'll do is point you to these two links. If you are interested in these questions and other questions, the Talking Black in America link here will take you to those resources. If you're interested in having a copy of the film, you can get it there. NSF has actually funded a 4-part miniseries that has moved us now to the second in the series called Signing Black in America. So if you're interested in Black American Sign Language, that film can be found on the YouTube link through the end of this month, and also at the Language and Life webpage, where you'll find other documentaries from the Language and Life Project. So with that, thank you so much for your time.